now we're going to use all the different scenes and files that we've created in order to create a tree and design custom specular maps, bump maps, and backlight maps to increase the realism of the overall species. I'm going to start by loading in our leaf creation file that we created earlier. And I'm going to create a new shape this time. So instead of using the shape we had created before, we're going to create a new one. And first going to create a new group, call this leaf shape 2. And actually I'm going to go ahead and change the group properties and give this a new color. Go ahead and make that blue, just so it stands out from the rest of our different layers. And now I'm going to select our custom shape tool. And if we go through all of these different shapes, we of course have the ability to create a maple leaf, which we can modify that. We could create our own entirely custom leaf by using paths and designing the shape in Photoshop. We could also combine different shapes together to create a lot of different types of leaves. I'm going to go in here and select our leaf 1 that we have that comes along with Photoshop, and making sure that we have a white for our color. I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and just draw out this leaf shape. Now we can see that there's a part of this leaf that's cut out, so we will be filling that in, and we're really only going to use part of this leaf and mirror that over like we did before. But I'm going to right mouse click into the open area of our layer and select Rasterize. And now I am going to hit Control T, and we can rotate this. Now if you want to be a little more specific about getting this straight, right now I'm showing rulers on the side. If you go to View and select Rulers or hit Control R on the keyboard, a really easy way to create guides is just to have the rulers open, and now we can click in our guide and move this out. And if you have snapping on, it will automatically snap to the center. I'm going to create one in the approximate center, and now move our leaf around to that center point, and now we can see that we do need to rotate this a little. And if we want, we could also create a guide from the top to line up these 2 points to make sure it really is angled correctly. And I'm just going to pull out our sides a little. But this is a little more of an interesting leaf. We've got some nice grooves cut on the side. And I'm going to center, looking at our reference point on the top, and put that in the middle of our center guide. And now we won't really need the guides anymore, or at least our horizontal one. One way we could delete our guides is making sure the Move tool is on, and we can select that and then drag it off the canvas, and that will delete it. If we take a look at the history, we can see we've deleted the guide. Also, if we go to View, we can clear all of our guides. We can also lock them in place. Locking them can be really helpful because sometimes if you're using the Move tool, let's say I go to move our shape layer, and if I highlight over our guide, we would end up moving the guide instead of moving our shape. So if we go to View and lock our guides, we now no longer have the ability to select that guide, and that could be really, really helpful when you're working on stuff like this. So I'm going to modify this leaf a little bit. I'm going to use our lasso tool and select part of this area on the top. And I may not have selected all the way down to that corner. I'll go ahead and zoom in, and what I could do is just move our selection a little bit over. And if you're still using the lasso tool without the Move tool, you won't have to worry about it actually cutting that part out and moving it. You can also right mouse click if you are in the Move tool and select Transform Selection. And that also gives you the ability to use the free transform tools that we have with any normal layer to modify the actual selection. I'm going to hit Escape, and now with this selected, I'm going to hit Control-C and Control-V, which is going to copy and paste. Now I'm going to hit Control-T, which is going to free transform, and what I can do is add a little bit to the bottom of this leaf using the shape we have cut out. And really, what section you want to use is up to you. And we may want to use that lower part. Just to fill in that area. We could go ahead and just paint it in, but this way we're getting crisper lines. And we can also add a little bit of a notch on the bottom if we want it. And that should be good right about there. I'm also going to hit Control-T once again and just squish that down. And then we want to line up the shapes on the bottom as close as possible. Maybe overlap this section that's curving down a little bit over our existing shape. We could also bring in that bottom part a little bit more using the warp tool and just pull that in. Hit Enter. V on the keyboard for the move tool. Readjust that if needed. We could also warp it a little bit more if we wanted to pull that up. Maybe bring that down, make a little bit more of a curve without disrupting our base. And that should be good right there. We've got a pretty interesting looking leaf. So now I'm going to hit Control-E, which is going to merge down these two layers. They're now connected, and we can fill in this part in the center. Just want to make sure I have white selected for our color. We can verify that by looking at the RGB values that are 255 all the way down. We also have an info window. If we take a look down at the bottom now, where our navigator is, if we highlight over part of the image, we can see the RGB values showing up in the info. That's another good way to verify your color. Let's switch that back to the navigator. And now with the paintbrush tool on, hardness set to 100%, increase our diameter, and all we need to do is make sure we have that shape selected, and we're going to paint and fill in that area. Now, a really easy way to make sure that you have everything filled in, to make sure you didn't miss any spots, you can double-click on your layer to open up the layer style, and we can select our stroke, change that to inside, and outside will also usually show up, but inside, it's a pretty good chance that it'll be able to show any missing pixels or any spots we missed. And we could just change the size on that. And since we don't see any of that red from our stroke, or whatever color you have set for the stroke, in the inside, we know that it is all covered up. So we can cancel that out. And now I'm going to use the marquee tool, hit M on the keyboard, and just drag out. And now, as you can see, I'm not snapping to our guide. So I'm going to deselect, go to View, and turn Snap on. And also under the Snap options, we have Snap To, and we can select Guides, Layers, Document Bounds, All or None. Well, I have our guides turned on, so now I can snap the marquee tool, and you can see that just kind of jump over to that guide. And now if I hit Delete, we can remove that side. I'm also going to go to View and clear our guide. And now all we need to do is make a copy and basically mirror it over. So V on the keyboard for the Move tool. I'm going to hold down Alt, which is going to allow us to create that copy. We could also select our layer, bring it down to the bottom here right next to the trash can, which will also make a copy. One of the nice things about using Alt, though, is it will allow us to move that copy that it instantly creates. It does save a lot of time. So I'm going to hit Control-T, right mouse click, and go to Flip Horizontally. Now in this case, it looks like we matched up pretty well, but I'm going to drag that over, and it will snap. And now Control E once again to take these two shapes and merge them together. And if I double click, we're going to go back to that stroke option and just make sure that we didn't miss any of our pixels in the center, because sometimes you can end up with a little bit of a line, but we can tell that we were able to successfully mirror that over. And now let's take a look at our layer style for this shape. First I'm going to change our layer properties, and we are going to call this shape 2 leaf. Double click in the gray area outside of the text, which will open up our layer style, and now we can go to inner shadow. I'm going to change our distance all the way down to 0, increase our size, and we can change the opacity amount. Click OK, and I want to change this to multiply. And that way we can see our shape with the pattern that we have set up for our veins. Now we can match this shape up a little bit better since we have some of these points coming out. You can maybe pull that down, and now we can see our veins are going to that bottom point and pretty close to that top one. Go ahead and bring that up a little bit more. Of course, you can always modify the veins, create new ones, or use an entirely different set of veins. If we go back to our vein group, I'm going to turn off what we had as our inverted ones. We can take a look at one of the other shapes that's in here. And this will be a cool little vein setup that we have. We just need to modify the shape just a little to match up, but right now it looks pretty close, and that's a pretty interesting looking shape. Typically these are veins you'd want to use for more tropical leaves, but I'm going to go back. We're going to select our other ones, and we have our original file, also our inverted one, with a lot more detail, but sometimes you don't need all of that detail. If we turn that one off and turn our top one on, we just have a very subtle amount of veins on there. So it's really up to you about how much detail you want. A good idea is to take a look at the references of different leaves and figure out exactly what kind of vein type they have. But once you have a really good leaf creation file where you can select from a bunch of different types of veins, you'll be able to choose all the different variations that you had set for yourself. And it makes the leaf creation much easier and much quicker. Go ahead and move that up just a little so we have this vein connecting, and this one would carry on, and that looks pretty good. We're going to go back to that layer style and just change the opacity amount, because we really don't want too much of a shadow in there. It's basically just a reference right now in order for us to see exactly where our shape is going to show up. And now we want to design our bump map that we're going to use with this leaf. And there's two different types of bump maps we can use. We can either use just this color image to get all of these fine little veins in there, all to show up. We might want to invert the color if we're going to use it as the bump. But what I like to do is design a specialized bump map for each shape, and that way we can really show the shape of the leaf and then also blend that together with our veins to get the fine details as well. Because sometimes color maps really aren't going to work all that well for a bump, depending on the variations you have. And when we end up creating this with different colors, then the bump map from color will have some raised areas and some that are lower. Based on color, where really it should be about the same on every leaf. So I'm going to create a couple of different shapes here to define our bump map. And first what I want to do is create a new group within our current group. And I'm going to call this bump. And we can see this is showing up in our existing group. And we could drag that below our current shape. And now I'm going to move to our ellipse tool to begin with. And what I want to do is really focus on the way this leaf would curve and bend. And to make it a little easier to see, I'm going to turn off our leaf color and also our veins so we can just see the shape. And we'll also need to go into our inner shadow on the shape. And I'm going to increase the opacity amount more as a reference, although we might be able to blend this together with our leaf as well. Maybe size it down so it curls a little bit on the edges. But first we want to design our main shape that we want, where these areas will kind of curve in. One of the easiest things to do is now we have our ellipse tool selected, and I'm just going to draw out a shape, and I'm going to rasterize that. And actually one thing I will do is bring that group back above our other shape because we do want it overlaying. Go to our layer style, turn on inner shadow, decrease the distance, increase the size a little, and lower the opacity amount. Mainly just for visual purpose right now. Change that to multiply. And now we're going to move this over. And what I want to look at is the way we would have a sort of a curvature on the bottom. And we just want to fit this. I'm going to move that out. Just looking at where these notches are and where we would want a little bit of a divot within the leaf. And Control T to free transform. I'm going to change that a little bit more. I'm also going to turn off snap right now, just because sometimes snap can interfere with some of the tools you want to use and the placement. Normally it's very useful, but sometimes it will get in the way and you do need to turn it off. So now we have this kind of initial shape set up. I'm going to double click to open up our layer style, and I'm going to select drop shadow, distance down to 0, and if you take a look at our inner shadow, we have an opacity of 34, so I'm going to go ahead and match that to 34, and we could match up our size as well. We have 70 pixels, so I want to make this one 70. We're going to see how that looks. And since bump maps work black and white being the higher part and black being the lower, we can see that this would create a nice little groove and divot within our leaf image. And we could change the size of that a little if we wanted. But that looks like it should be good for now. And now I want to create a copy of this layer. So Alt with the Move tool on, and I'm going to drag that down to the bottom. And now we want to modify this with free transform. And we're going to get this to match up with that shape a little bit better. Just kind of stretching it down and getting it to match up with our grooves. We're not going to worry about the top part right now because we will be using the eraser tool to remove a lot of these sections. We just want the initial shapes to be covered and then use our layer styles as best we can and then kind of remove some of those areas. And I'm also going to create a copy of this new one to bring down to the bottom. And we'll squish that in a little to match that curvature. And we can move that over pretty close to the center. With this last one, I'm going to open up our layer style. And first for our drop shadow, I'm going to change the size because we don't want that one very large. We still want to be able to see a raised area on the bottom. And click OK. And now I'm going to go back to our main leaf shape, open that up, and for the inner shadow, I'm going to go ahead and scale that down a little bit. Just because we want to make this mainly for our edges, and not so much for the inside depth. We'll be using different shapes and layers for that. And now we want to create our shape for the center, for the stem, and how we want that area raised. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool and just draw this out, kind of a thinner stem. And then we can right mouse click, rasterize that, and I'm going to drag this back into the bump. And we're going to double click, and it looks like we will need to center it, but for right now it should be fine. Select inner shadow, change our distance down to 0, and we already have a really nice look with the default there. Change our opacity amount, and that should be good. Now we can see a lot of blending with our other bump materials, so we may need to change the way we want this to look, whether or not we want to use the multiply mode or not, but we'll get to that once we start removing the areas we don't need. I do want to turn on drop shadow, change the distance, size that up a bit, and let's pay attention to our top area here and not where our intersections are, because that's what it's really going to end up looking like. Adjust our opacity, and we just want that little bit of a divot before it reaches the stem. We could go back into the inner shadow for the stem and increase our size a very small amount, if needed. We want something very subtle, because we don't want the stem sticking out too far. Go back to our drop shadow, maybe increase its size a little. Adjust our opacity, and just kind of play around with it until it looks like it would be a good bump. I'm going to click OK, hit V on the keyboard, and now we're going to center this right in the middle of our leaf. And what we could also do is, since we had the stem designed from before, we could have also used that shape to really match it up, but I am going to be modifying that to blend in a little bit better. And now, so we can start working on the other areas and really seeing what we have so far, I'm going to go ahead and start rasterizing some of these layers, and we can erase the parts we don't need. So I'm going to turn off our stem and our lower sections, and we're just going to take a look at how this is blending. We may want to increase those shadow sizes just a little to make them come in a little bit more. Go to our drop shadow, increase that size, maybe increase the opacity on that one. But we don't want to create a line or a sharp line. So actually I'm going to set this back to 34, and that way we have a nice blend. But of course, because of the size and the spread values, it may not match up perfectly. And that looks like it should be good right around in there. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we can erase these side areas. But before we can do that, we will need to get rid of our layer style and make this just part of the image. Because right now, if we were to start erasing, we'll see our shadows and all of those effects showing up on the erased parts, and it's still part of the active shape. So I'm going to create a new layer, which is going to go underneath that shape. Control and click on both of these layers, hit Control E, and now we have our new shape. I'll set that to multiply so we can see behind it. And I'm going to select our eraser tool, increase our diameter, and I'm going to bring our hardness to about 20% to begin with. Increase our diameter of our brush a little bit larger, remove that top area, And we're going to kind of stay away from that blend because we really don't need to worry about that too much because it's outside of the leaf. We really want to focus on what's inside of our shape. And now I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to our other two shapes that we have so we can get those shadows in there on the bottom two parts. And now I'm going to go through each one and just take the eraser tool and move it along the top just to make sure we got everything. And I could also go ahead and rename these and also set them in the order in which they show up on the canvas. And I'm just going to do top, mid, and lower. And I also want these center parts to fade a little more to white because we don't want them the same depth all the way throughout. They'll mainly just have this depth towards the edges. So what I can use is our shape that we had created before for our stem. I'm just going to create a copy and drag that up into the top of our bump group. And I'm going to rename this center. Go ahead and turn that on. And now we're going to edit the layer style. And we can turn off the drop and inner shadow. And what we want to turn on is outer glow. And by default, the color is kind of yellow. We're going to go ahead and change that to white. And now we can adjust our size and spread to make it so that those centers kind of fade off into the inside. And we can just make our adjustments until it looks about the way we want it. I'm also going to make sure that I have our opacity set to 100%, and that way we're not going to have that fine white line down the center from the actual shape. And that should be good right about there. You could also make other adjustments if you want to tweak it a little. And it really depends on the kind of effect you're looking for. We could also use contour. You can see the contours will create certain shapes. So if you have a different kind of leaf, you can go ahead and use these other shapes and make sure you turn on anti-aliased for it. You can adjust the range of the shape and whether or not there's a jitter to it. I'm going to use the lower left curve, and that'll allow us to really remove the center a lot more and kind of fade towards the edges and make it look a little bit better. But of course you don't have to use that if you don't want to. And then we can take a look at the difference, the way it used to look and the way it looks now. Go ahead and click OK. We could also change that to multiply, but then we can see that center part showing up. So if we have it set to normal, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to our info, and take a look at the RGB value, and just make sure that it is white in the center, and we have a good fade. It looks like we have it going from white and only stepping down 1 point all the way to the end, and that's a good fade, and that's exactly what we're looking for. And if we take a look at the bottom, we can see that we've lost almost all of our detail down there. So hit Control T. What I'm going to do is just pull in this shape, move it up a bit, in order to bring some of that definition back. We can also go ahead and copy this and create specific layers for each section. and hit enter. And I do want to go back and take a look at that curve. And it looks like the curve might be a little bit too much. So what we can do is modify the curve just by clicking on it. And I'm just going to bring in the curve a little bit. And you can, of course, make any sort of shape you want. And you can see by pulling in the different sections, we can create different types of effects. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull that down a little bit more. Maybe realign these points. And that looks like it should be good. So I'm going to click OK. We could also adjust the range to open it up a bit more, really depending on preference. Click OK. And now let's go ahead and hit V on the keyboard for move. And I want to move this down because before we couldn't see the top, and we don't want that affecting our top area. You can also hit Control T again, and now we can scale that down, move it up, and I want to get it to a point where I'm not affecting the bottom because I do want to have a separate layer for that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this center, Control T, and make it pretty small. And now we can move that down to the bottom, open up the layer style, go to the outer glow, and I'm going to adjust our size and our spread just so we can modify that bottom part and not have it as dramatic as it was. So it's still showing up. Click OK. Move that up a bit. And we're going to zoom in and take a look at that area. Go to our info and just make sure that we're not going to have any really harsh cutoffs. And it doesn't look like it really goes entirely to white, so that's okay. We do have a good blend. And if we need to, we can move it up a little bit higher so we're not affecting the bottom as much. But that looks like it should be good. So now our edges are taken care of, and we're going to take a look at the rest of it. And I want to give our background more of a medium color. Right now we have it set to white. I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of the background. And what I can do is just open up, create a layer style for it, create a color overlay, which we're going to have set to black. And we can adjust the opacity. But right now what we can see is because that center section is not set to the multiply blend mode, we will need to either merge our other layers, or we could set a different blending mode in order to get that to show up correctly. So I think I'm going to merge these, turn off that background copy that we'd created, and I also want to make a copy of our original shape, put that underneath, and just turn it off for now, because we're still going to need that shape in order to create our clip, and we're going to be merging these together. First, I'm going to open the layer style, take a look at our inner shadow, which we have at 32 opacity, and I'm going to set our drop shadow to the same. And this way we have a nice blend on the outside. And that way, depending on the way our clipping mode is set, we don't have to worry about any weird cutoffs. And we just want that to blend fairly well. We can see that some of the areas on the tips might get a little bit darker, but overall it's blending really good, and that should be sufficient. Go ahead and click OK. And now I want to merge all of these together. So I'm going to create a new layer and make sure it's on the bottom of all of our other layers. And we can select all of them now, hit Control E, and we now have this new shape layer. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and undo that really quick because we have our stem still in there. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out, go back, and remerge. And now we can go back down to that background copy, turn that on, set our blending mode to multiply for that new object we created. And I'm going to rename this edge bump. And now we're going to take a look a little more at the center. We have our center shape for our stem. Then I'm going to set to multiply. And we want to go ahead and adjust that to blend in a little bit better. And we're just looking for a medium color right now, and then we can go in and make adjustments to which areas we want to be higher and lower after we have this set to look pretty good. Go to our drop shadow, adjust the opacity a little, because we want that little bit of a divot. We could adjust our contour, make it a little more harsh. And then we want to make sure our inner shadow is matching up to that. But not too harsh, of course, because otherwise it's really going to be popping off of our leaf, and that's not what we want. We just want a very subtle, little bit of a bump. And that should be good right there. So go ahead and click OK. And if we take a look at the bottom, we see a little bit of overlay. So what I will want to do is just go to our clone stamp tool, increase our diameter a little, hold down Alt to select our area around in the center of our above line, and go ahead and click in there. And I'm going to undo, maybe make our brush a little bit larger, and just redo that. And that way we have a nice blend all the way throughout. And that looks pretty good. And now we want to start to raise up our center area. One thing I'm going to do is just turn on our original shape layer. Go ahead and make a copy of it. And then we can turn off the original. I'm going to drag that up above the rest of these. I'm going to go into our layer style and just turn all the layer style settings off. Set it to normal. And now if I hit Control T, I can size that down a little, and we're going to fit it just kind of into the inside. Scale that down a little bit more. And now I'm going to switch to our eraser tool. And if you want this to be perfect, you can just do this to one side and then copy it over. I should be able to get pretty close. And what we're going to do is cut out some of these center areas. Go ahead and redo that. And maybe get a little bit better. And that should be pretty good right there. I'm going to turn our hardness down to 0. Go way down to the bottom. Go ahead and remove some of this section. And then we can create something else for the bottom. But this should work out pretty well. I'm going to take care of these corners. just to begin with. And just get rid of any harsh edges along the top. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And that should be good. I'm going to create a copy really quick, just to come back to if needed. But now with that selected, I'm going to go to Filter, select Blur, do a Gaussian, and create a rather large Gaussian blur, just so we can raise up those areas. And this works pretty well, as we can see, for these different sections. Although we may need to make some overall adjustments afterwards, it gives us a really good starting point to raise that up. And I'm going to hit Control-T, and we can pull that out, maybe a little bit more to have a better blend. Also on the top, but we're still getting the center areas pretty good. And we're hitting the edges a little and going over, but we still have that nice depth that we added earlier, and we still have the original shape that we could always add more to that if needed. And for the bottom, I'm just going to paint it. So I'm going to create a new layer and select our brush tool, working with white, and we'll turn our hardness down. And I just want to go ahead and paint something in there. And if you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet, you could just press lightly on the edges and create a little bit of a better line, but this should work pretty well. Because we're just going to blur it quite a bit. And we'll go ahead and move that up. Control-T to adjust the size. Maybe pull that out. Maybe a little bit more. Just until it looks pretty close. We could also adjust the opacity value of those Gaussians to blend it a little bit more if you've gone too far with it, or really depending on what type of surface you have. And now we need to balance out the center, so it's basically white throughout. And this time I'm going to use the rounded rectangle tool and set our radius up to 100 up here at the top. And that way it's just going to be perfectly round when we draw this out. And we don't need to extend all the way to the end, but we should be able to come pretty close. We'll just draw that out, and now we see that perfect rounding on the end. If I was to create another one, you could really see the size of that 100 pixels, but that's just, it's really going over what we need just to make sure that it stays round. And I'm going to rasterize this layer, and now go to our Gaussian blur. And we just want to balance this out. We may need to tone it down a little bit, or even create a couple of different Gaussians in order to get it to look correct. But just as long as we get it pretty close, we should be able to end up with a nice balance in the center. And I'm going to go ahead and create a copy of that. Control-T. Move that in a little, pull it out on the sides, and we can use this reference point in the center just when we're pulling this out to match it up to that stem we can still see. And you can adjust the opacity amount to get it to blend. But that looks like it should be good, and we have a good balance mainly throughout. Could pull that down, to the bottom a little bit more. And that looks pretty good. Maybe adjust the top a little. And now we're going to go back to that stem, drag that up above the rest of our layers, because we need that to be pretty well balanced too. We could adjust the opacity amount so that we don't have it really dipping in, because we don't want it to come out too far. And really take a look at the grayscale values just in relation to everything else on the leaf. And if you're used to working with bump maps where you have black as the lowest amount, white as the highest, you can really start to get an idea. Plus, even looking at it, you can see it works just like shading does. And you can really see the depth just looking at it. And if it looks like the bottom, these ones are coming in a little too much, we could also make a shape for the lower area. Go ahead and rasterize that. Control T so we can get a reference to center. Go up to our Gaussian blur, and we could create a little bit of a larger blur for that. Click OK. V for the move tool, and then Control T for the free transform. And we could pull that out a little bit more to get it to blend. Adjust our opacity. And then you can see the difference, how that lightens it up a little bit better, a little more of a blend. And we may need to adjust our center, maybe expand it a little bit more so it covers a larger range. We could go ahead and copy another version of that, pull it out even more, more towards the edges, just to get that center to blend a little bit better. And then you could add more shapes in the inside to get that to come out. But it really depends on how much work you want to spend on it. And for most leaves, you won't need to spend this much time on the bump, but because we have these ridges and I want it to look really good and as realistic as possible, you sometimes need to spend a little bit more time to get that to look correct. And another thing we could do just to balance that out is if we go down to that background copy into our color overlay, we could reduce the opacity amount to get rid of our medium color and lighten it up a little bit more. And we will need to adjust that stem to get it to show up better. But sometimes these are just really easy fixes. And just little tweaking we can do to make it look as good as possible. Because once we have this created, we can use it over and over again, changing our leaf color, and basically once this leaf is set, we're pretty much good to go with using it with our template and other scenes. So we'll just go to our center shape again, make sure that's above the rest, set it to normal. You could adjust the opacity to bring that down more. We could also create another copy behind it if you want it to dip more into the center, which some leaves will have a little more curvature in the center. You could create another layer to compensate for that. It really depends on, of course, what kind you are working on and what type of leaf you have. And if we want to add a little more detail and some more variation, what we can do is create a new layer. And I'm going to select the brush tool. We're going to change this to black. I'm just going to create very small dabs around our leaf. And we can create a different size, some smaller ones. And now what I can do is go ahead and make a copy of that, V for the move tool, flip it horizontally, and just bring it over to the other side, match it up a bit, merge those together, and now go to our filter and Gaussian blur that. And we're not going to do it a really large amount. Control T, and we can move that in if we wanted to make it a little bit bigger. And then we can adjust our opacity value to kind of blend that in. And this will create small little divots and little dips on the end of the leaf, just around the edges. And that can sometimes add a little more realism, because not every leaf is perfectly straight. You could create some larger paint dabs if you wanted to increase that overall size, but it's just a neat little thing you can do to add to your bump map. And I am going to modify our color map a little to add some more custom veins where our stem areas are going to be sticking out. So one thing I want to do is first this center stem that we have, I'm going to set that back to multiply. And we can adjust that setting depending on how much we would like to go in. And what I'm going to do is make a copy. And now Control T, hit Enter. Now Control T again, and warp it. And now what we can have is some custom stems, or little parts of the vein, going to the center to match along with the leaf shape a little bit more. And then we're going to use these same layers and shapes in order to add extra color to our color map part. And then we'll also be using this to modify our specular settings, and also working on our backlight maps to add even more realism to the entire scene. And now I'm going to be deleting some of those other sections, but I will need to merge them together and blend them a little bit more. I'm also going to create a copy of this. Control T, and we can just fit this onto our lower stem. And you can adjust your sizing options and your shadow in order to make it look smaller, or you could stretch it down a little first so it's not the same size. I'm going to make one more copy, and we can use that on the center, or on the bottom, the center part. And if we need to use a more curved area, we've got a lot of variation in here. And that looks pretty good, so we'll be able to blend these up together. And pretty much the same way we worked with the other edges, we can merge these all together and then kind of erase the ends. And because of the depth of these, won't be nearly as high as our center one. We can go ahead and tone that down a bit, down to 34 for opacity, and we'll go ahead and do that for all of them. That looks pretty good. And since we're going to use these also for the color, it's a good idea to create a copy. And one thing we can do is select all three of these that we just created, create a new group from the layers, and I'm going to call this back for backup, and then we could call this side. And we'll just create a copy of the entire group, turn it off, And we'll go back into here and create a new layer. And we're going to merge all of these together. Set that back to multiply. Go to our eraser tool. Size this up. Maybe a little bit more. And then we can work around the edges. In order to get that to blend a little bit better. And then if we take a look at the center, where that's connecting, we need to make sure that has a good transition. So I'm going to move this all the way up to where our stem basically starts and delete. Just using the marquee tool and then hitting delete on the keyboard. And if you wanted to blend those together, the best thing to do is once you're done, just kind of take the clone stamp tool and just fill in those areas, or create a box, a white box that you can Gaussian blur. And now we can create a copy of this to flip over to the other side. Just the same way as we did before, holding down Alt with the Move command selected, creating that copy, and then we're going to move that over and fit that up. And that looks pretty good. And this should create a very good bump map, at least the base shape bump map. We'll be using the image from our color map in the veins to also kind of blend that together. And next we're going to start using pieces of our bump map that we've just created and modifying our color map to make it a little more unique, a little more specialized. And then we can start working on the backside leaf that we're going to have in all of our other maps, our specular maps and backlight maps. But I hope this section has showed you a little bit more how you can create really good looking bump maps that will really create some amazing detail once we get into view with it. Because sometimes determining that shape is really important, and a lot of the default leaves just have fractal nodes and noise nodes applied to them rather than something completely custom. And with our templates, we really only need to make the bump for one leaf, and then it'll be able to copy that over, and then we'll be able to render out our bump map versions. And we'll also be editing the branch to have a bump map too, although that one's a little bit simpler than our leaf bump.